The afternoon sun was setting behind the mountains when James McCarthy sat down on his old wooden porch. He had a rifle across his lap, and he was cleaning it the way he did every evening. This had become his routine. Every single day felt the same, and that's exactly how he wanted it. James had been living alone in this cabin for 7 long years. The cabin sat in the hills of Arizona Territory, far away from any town or neighbor. You could walk for miles and not see another soul. That's why he chose this place. He wasn't always a hermit. There was a time when James had a wife named Mary. She had the prettiest smile he'd ever seen, and she could make him laugh even on the hardest days. They had a baby daughter too, little Elizabeth. She was barely 6 months old when the fever came through their town. It happened so fast. One week they were a happy family, and the next week both Mary and Elizabeth were gone. The fever took them within days of each other. James buried them on a hillside overlooking the ranch where they'd lived. After that, something inside him just broke. He couldn't stay in that town anymore. Everywhere he looked, he saw memories. The general store where Mary bought fabric for baby clothes. The church where they'd gotten married. Even the sound of a baby crying would make his chest tighten until he couldn't breathe. So he left. He took his horse, a gray mare he called Ash, and he rode until he found this place. The cabin was already here, abandoned by whoever built it years before. James fixed it up, made it livable. It had 4 walls, a roof, and most importantly, it was far from people. The locals in the nearest town, Copper Springs, talked about him sometimes. He knew that. The few times he went into town for supplies, maybe twice a year, he could feel their stares. They whispered about the crazy hermit living up in the hills. Some said he'd lost his mind. Others said he was dangerous. James didn't care what they said, he preferred it that way. The less people bothered him, the better. His days followed a simple pattern. He woke up with the sun, made coffee, and checked on Ash. He hunted when he needed meat, tended a small vegetable garden, and chopped wood for the winter. In the evenings, he sat on the porch and watched the sunset. Sometimes he'd see a coyote in the distance, or hear an owl calling from the pine trees. That was all the company he needed. At night, he'd light a fire in the stone fireplace and sit in his chair. Sometimes he'd read from one of the 3 books he owned. Other times, he'd just stare at the flames and try not to think about Mary's, laugh, or the way baby Elizabeth used to grab his finger with her tiny hand. James told himself he was fine with this life. He'd made peace with being alone. People were complicated. They asked questions. They wanted things from you. Out here, with just the wind and the trees, life was simple. No one could hurt him, because no one could get close enough to matter. His cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by tall pines. There was a small stream about 100 yards away where he got water. The mountains rose up behind the cabin, protecting it from the worst of the winter storms. In front, the land sloped down toward the valley, giving him a clear view of anyone approaching. Not that anyone ever did. The town folk called him the Ghost of Silver Ridge. James had heard that nickname once when he was buying flour and coffee in Copper Springs. The shopkeeper's wife had whispered it to her friend, not realizing he could hear. He'd almost smiled. A ghost was exactly what he wanted to be. Invisible. Forgotten. He kept his rifle clean and his property secure. There were still dangers out here. Mountain lions sometimes came around. Bears, too. Especially in the fall. And there were stories about Apache raiding parties, though James had never seen any sign of them. The Apache wars had been going on for years, but they seemed far away from his little corner of the territory. James had built walls around his heart thicker than the logs of his cabin. He'd promised himself after burying Mary and Elizabeth that he'd never care about anyone again. Caring hurt too much. Love was just a setup for loss. Better to feel nothing at all. Every evening, as the sun painted the sky orange and red, James would sit in the same spot and clean his guns. The repetitive motion was soothing. Take apart the rifle, clean each piece, oil it, put it back together. Simple. Predictable. Safe. He'd look out at the vast emptiness around him and feel something like contentment. Or maybe it wasn't contentment. Maybe it was just numbness. But numbness was better than pain, so he'd take it. The wind would blow through the pines, making them whisper and sway. James would listen to that sound and think about nothing at all. No past, no future. Just the present moment, stretching out like the shadows across his porch. He had everything he needed: food, shelter, and solitude. What else could a man want? He'd convinced himself that this was enough, that he could live out the rest of his days right here, never speaking to another person, never letting anyone close enough to matter. James McCarthy had become a man of routine and silence. His world had shrunk down to this cabin, this clearing, these mountains. And he told himself every single night as he locked his door and banked the fire that this was exactly the life he wanted. He had no idea that everything was about to change. He didn't know that in just a few hours a sound would come from his porch that would shatter his carefully built solitude. He couldn't imagine that his closed heart was about to be forced open again, whether he wanted it or not. But that evening, as he finished cleaning his rifle and the last light faded from the sky, James was still the hermit of Silver Ridge, still alone, still safe behind his walls, still convinced that this was how the rest of his life would be. Tomorrow would prove him wrong. The sound came just as the sun was setting. James was inside the cabin lighting the oil lamp on his table. It was a strange sound, like something heavy being dragged across wood. Then he heard it again, a scraping, desperate sound against his front door. James froze. His hand moved to the gun on his hip without thinking. In 7 years, nothing bigger than a raccoon had ever come to his door. Animals knew better than to get close to a human dwelling. This was something different. He grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. His heart was pounding as he moved toward the door. Who could it be? Had someone from town finally decided to bother him? Or was it something worse? "Get off my property!" James called out, his voice rough from lack of use. There was no answer. Just that scraping sound again, weaker this time. James yanked the door open, rifle raised and ready. Then he froze, his breath catching in his throat. On his porch, collapsed in a heap, was a young girl. She couldn't have been more than 15 years old. Her clothes were traditional Apache, made from deerskin and decorated with beautiful beadwork. But what caught his attention immediately was the blood. There was so much blood. Her dress was soaked with it, dark and wet in the fading light. She'd been shot. James could see the wound in her left shoulder, still bleeding. The girl's face was pale, her lips almost white. She was barely breathing. Her eyes opened, and James found himself looking into the darkest eyes he'd ever seen. Even weakened and dying, there was a fierceness in those eyes, a strength. She tried to say something, but the words came out in Apache. James didn't understand the language. She reached toward him with her good hand, her fingers trembling. Then her eyes rolled back and she went completely still. For a horrible moment, James thought she was dead. But no, he could see her chest still rising and falling, just barely. James stood there paralyzed. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him. "Close the door, walk away. This isn't your problem. You don't get involved with people anymore." That was the rule he'd lived by for 7 years. Apache girl on his porch meant trouble. The army had been rounding up Apache bands for months, forcing them onto reservations. There were stories about fights and raids. If soldiers found an Apache girl at his cabin, they'd have questions. Lots of questions. Questions. James didn't want to answer. He should close the door, let nature take its course. He didn't ask for this. He didn't want this. But as he stood there looking down at her, something shifted inside him. The girl's face, pale and still, reminded him of someone. Elizabeth, his baby daughter. Of course, this girl looked nothing like Elizabeth. Elizabeth had been just a baby, and this was a teenager. Elizabeth had light hair and blue eyes, and this girl was Apache. But there was something in the helplessness, in the innocent vulnerability, that hit him like a punch to the chest. He remembered holding Elizabeth when the fever took her. How small and fragile she'd felt in his arms. How he'd promised her he'd keep her safe and then failed. He'd failed Mary, too. He'd failed everyone he'd ever loved. James's hands were moving before his brain could catch up. He set the rifle down and bent to lift the girl. She was lighter than he expected and burning up with fever. He carried her inside and laid her on his own bed. It was the only bed in the cabin. The lamplight was better, and now James could see the wound clearly. It was a bullet wound, no question. Someone had shot this girl. The bullet had gone clean through her shoulder, missing the bone. That was lucky, at least. If it had shattered bone, there wouldn't be much he could do. James's mind raced as he gathered supplies. clean cloth for bandages, water from the bucket by the stove, whiskey for cleaning the wound, a needle and thread in case he needed to stitch anything. His hands were shaking. He hadn't treated a person in years. Back when he worked on the ranch, he'd helped with the horses sometimes. Set a broken leg once, cleaned wounds, delivered a foal. But that was animals, not people. And it was a long time ago. Still, a wound was a wound. The principles were the same. Clean it, stop the bleeding. Watch for infection. James heated water on the stove and washed his hands. Then he carefully cut away the deerskin dress around the wound. The entry wound wasn't huge, but it was deep. The exit wound on her back was messier. James cleaned both sides as gently as he could. The girl groaned in her unconscious state but didn't wake. He could feel the fever burning through her skin. Infection. That was the biggest danger now. James poured whiskey over the wounds, knowing it would hurt, but also knowing it was necessary. The girl's body jerked and she cried out something in Apache. Her eyes didn't open, but tears leaked from beneath her closed lids. "I'm sorry," James whispered. It was the first time he'd apologized to anyone in 7 years. "I'm trying to help." He bandaged the wounds as best he could, using strips torn from his spare shirt. The white cloth quickly showed spots of red, but the bleeding was slowing. That was good. He covered her with his only blanket and stepped back. Now what? James ran his hand through his hair and looked at the girl lying in his bed. What had he done? He'd just invited trouble right into his home. Soldiers could come looking for her. Her own people might come looking for her. Either way, his peaceful solitude was shattered. He should have closed the door. But even as he thought it, James knew he couldn't have. Something in him, some part he thought had died with Mary and Elizabeth, had woken up. That part wouldn't let a child die on his porch, no matter who she was or what trouble she brought. James pulled his chair close to the bed and sat down with his rifle across his lap. He'd keep watch through the night. If she got worse, what? There was no doctor within a day's ride. He'd just have to do his best and hope it was enough. As the night deepened and the only sounds were the crackling fire and the girl's labored breathing, James McCarthy realized something. His life of solitude was over. Whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. James didn't sleep that first night. He sat in his chair beside the bed, rifle ready, watching the girl breathe. Sometimes her breathing was so shallow he'd lean closer, making sure she was still alive. Other times she'd gasp and thrash, crying out words he couldn't understand. The fever was bad. By midnight, she was burning up so hot that James could feel the heat radiating from her skin. He'd seen fever like this before. It had taken Mary and Elizabeth. The memory made his hands shake as he dipped a cloth in cool water and wiped the girl's forehead. "Don't you die," he muttered. "Not in my house. Not on my watch." He changed her bandages twice during the night. Each time he checked the wounds carefully. They looked clean enough, no sign of the angry redness that meant infection. That was something at least. But the fever worried him. Fever could kill just as surely as a bullet. Around 3 in the morning, the girl started shaking violently. Her teeth chattered and her whole body trembled under the blanket. James added another blanket, then his coat. He built up the fire until the cabin was almost too hot, but still she shook. He sat back down, feeling helpless. What else could he do? He knew about treating horses and cattle, but this was a person. A young girl who was fighting for her life in his cabin. And he had no idea if he was doing the right things. As dawn light started to creep through the window, the fever finally broke. The girl's shaking stopped. Her breathing evened out. Her skin was still warm, but not the terrifying burning heat from before. James let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He must have dozed off in his chair because the next thing he knew, the sun was fully up, and there was movement from the bed. James jerked awake, hand going to his gun. The girl's eyes were open, really open, not the half-conscious glaze from the night before. She was looking right at him. They stared at each other for a long moment. Her eyes were alert now, taking in everything. The cabin, the rifle, James himself. He could see her mind working, assessing the situation. Was she safe? Was he a threat? Where was she? James slowly held up his empty hands. "You're safe," he said, keeping his voice low and calm like he was talking to a spooked horse. "You were shot. I'm helping you." The girl didn't respond. She probably didn't understand much English. Her eyes went to the bandages on her shoulder, then back to him. She tried to sit up and immediately went pale, gasping with pain. "Don't move," James said. He poured water into a tin cup and held it out to her. "Drink." She looked at the cup suspiciously. James took a sip himself first, then offered it again. This time she took it with her good hand. Her hand shook so badly that water slopped over the rim, but she managed to drink. When she finished, she handed the cup back and spoke a single word in Apache. James shook his head. "I don't understand." The girl pointed at the cup, then at herself, then made a motion toward her mouth. She wanted more water or maybe food. James nodded. He had some jerky and hardtack bread. Not much, but it was something. He set the food on the small table beside the bed, close enough that she could reach it when she was ready. Then he backed away to the far side of the cabin, giving her space. The girl watched him move, her eyes tracking his every step. For the rest of that day, they existed in tense silence. The girl ate a little bit of the jerky, chewing slowly. She drank more water. Mostly she just lay there watching James with those dark, wary eyes. James tried to go about his normal routine, but it was impossible to act normal with someone staring at you. He made coffee. She watched. He cleaned his rifle. She watched. He added wood to the fire. She watched. It was unnerving, but James understood. She was in a stranger's house, wounded and alone. Of course she was cautious. The second day was much the same. James changed her bandages in the morning. The wounds looked better, definitely no infection setting in. The girl barely flinched as he worked, though he knew it had to hurt. She had remarkable self-control for someone so young. He tried to communicate with gestures and simple words. "Water," he'd say, pointing at the cup. "Food," pointing at the jerky. "Fire," pointing at the fireplace. The girl listened but didn't try to repeat the words. On the third morning, James woke to find the girl sitting up in bed. She'd managed to prop herself against the wall. Her face was pale and she was clearly in pain, but there was determination in her eyes. She'd pushed the blanket aside and was examining her bandages. "Those need changing," James said, reaching for his supplies. The girl pulled back slightly, but she didn't stop him when he approached. As he worked, carefully unwrapping the old bandages, she spoke. "Soldiers." James's hands froze. He looked up at her face. She was looking right at him, and she'd spoken in English, one word heavily accented but clear as day. "Soldiers," she repeated. Then she made a motion with her good hand like a gun firing. "Bang!" James nodded slowly. "Soldiers shot you," the girl nodded back. Then she touched her chest and said another word in Apache. She repeated it several times, slower each time, until James understood she was telling him her name. "Nasha," he said, trying to pronounce it the way she had. The girl, Nasha, nodded. Then she pointed at James with a questioning look. "James," he said, tapping his own chest. "My name is James." "James," she repeated carefully. It came out more like Yames, but close enough. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next few days, a fragile understanding began to form between them. Nasha's English was limited, but better than James had first thought. She knew maybe 50 words, enough for basic communication. She'd learned some English from missionaries or traders, James figured. Through simple words and elaborate hand gestures, Nasha told her story. Her band had been traveling to the reservation, escorted by soldiers. There had been an argument. She didn't have the English words to explain exactly what happened, but James got the general idea. Things had turned violent. Nasha had been near the back of the group with some other young people. When the shooting started, she ran. A bullet caught her as she scrambled into the rocks. She'd hidden in a cave for a day, then started walking. She followed the smoke from James's chimney, hoping to find help or at least shelter. It had taken her 3 days to reach the cabin. 3 days of walking wounded, hiding from patrols and fighting fever. James was amazed she'd made it at all. As Nasha grew stronger, she started helping around the cabin in small ways. She'd fold the blankets, organize the food supplies. She'd watch James cook and offer suggestions through gestures, showing him how to add wild herbs to make the rabbit stew taste better. And James, who had barely spoken a word in 7 years, found himself talking. At first it was just naming things as he worked. "This is a knife. This is wood. This is the stove." But then, one evening as they sat by the fire, he started telling her about Mary and Elizabeth. He didn't know if Nasha understood all the words, but she listened with her full attention, her eyes on his face. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she touched her own chest and said a single word. "Typhoid." James understood. She'd lost family to sickness, too. The fever epidemics had swept through Apache camps just like they'd swept through white settlements. Death didn't care what color your skin was. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition. They were both survivors, both carrying grief that was too heavy for words. Nasha was alone in the world just like James was alone. As the days passed, James realized something strange was happening. He was getting used to having someone else in the cabin. He'd catch himself looking forward to showing Nasha something new, like how to play the harmonica he'd almost forgotten he owned. Or he'd find himself smiling when she made a joke in her limited English. The walls he'd built around his heart were developing cracks, and for the first time in 7 years, James wasn't sure he wanted to repair them. 2 weeks had passed since Nasha collapsed on James's porch. Her shoulder was healing well, though she still couldn't use that arm much. She moved around the cabin now, slowly and carefully, but moving. The color had returned to her face, and she'd started eating better. James had learned that Nasha meant owl in her language. It fit her somehow. She had that same watchful quality. Those keen eyes that seemed to see everything. She moved quietly, too, like an owl in flight. Sometimes James would turn around and find her right behind him, and he hadn't heard a single footstep. Their communication improved every day. Nasha's English got better, and James learned a few Apache words. It was slow going, but they managed. What they couldn't say with words, they said with gestures and expressions. One afternoon, James was outside chopping wood when Nasha came out and sat on the porch step. It was the first time she'd been outside since arriving. She lifted her face to the sun and closed her eyes, breathing in the mountain air. "Good," she said in English. "Outside good," James nodded, splitting another log. "Yeah, it gets stuffy in the cabin." Nasha watched him work for a while. Then she said, "You teach me?" "Teach you what?" "English?" She pointed at the axe. "Teach me work." "I help." James stopped mid-swing. "Your shoulder isn't healed enough for chopping wood?" "Other work," Nasha insisted. "I help, not just sit." James understood. She had her pride. She didn't want to be helpless, didn't want to just take without giving something back. He respected that. "All right," he said, "but nothing too heavy. You can help with the garden. Pull weeds, check for ripe vegetables." Nasha's face lit up with a smile. It was the first real smile James had seen from her, and it changed her whole face. She looked younger, less haunted, more like the teenager she actually was. Over the following days, they fell into a new routine. James would do the heavy work like chopping wood and hunting. Nasha would work in the garden, mend clothes, and help with cooking. She taught James things about plants he'd never known. Which wild herbs were good for tea, which berries were safe to eat, and which would make you sick. She knew the land in ways he'd never learned. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire and share stories. Nasha's English was getting good enough now for real conversations. She told James about her childhood, growing up in the mountains with her band. She described how they moved with the seasons, following game and gathering food. She talked about her father, who had been a skilled hunter, and her mother, who made beautiful baskets. "Where are they now?" James asked one night. Nasha's face grew sad. "Soldiers take them reservation. 2 years ago. My father, he gets sick there. Many people get sick. Bad water, bad food. He die first winter. And your mother? Still there, I think." "I hope." Nasha stared into the fire. "Reservation, very bad place. Not enough food. Not enough medicine. People just waiting to die." James felt anger rise in his chest. He'd heard stories about the reservations, but he'd never paid much attention. It wasn't his problem, or so he'd told himself. Now, sitting across from this girl who'd lost so much, it felt very much like his problem. "Your band was trying to go to the reservation?" he asked. Nasha nodded. "Soldiers say we must go, no choice. We are last group still free. They find us, make us go. My brother, he want to fight. The young men want to fight. But elders say no. Too many already dead. Better go reservation, stay alive." "So what happened? Why did the soldiers shoot?" Nasha's hands clenched. "One young man, he very angry. He say he rather die than live in cage. He pull knife. Soldier get scared, start shooting. Then all soldiers shooting. People running everywhere. Many people die. I run too." She fell silent, reliving the horror of that day. James didn't push for more details. He could see it in her eyes, the trauma of what she'd witnessed. "Your brother," James said quietly. "Did he survive?" "I don't know." Nasha's voice was barely a whisper. "I run different way. I not see him after shooting start. Maybe he dead, maybe soldiers catch him. She wiped at her eyes angrily, refusing to cry. I think about him every day. I hope he alive somewhere. James knew that feeling. The not knowing was sometimes worse than knowing. At least when Mary and Elizabeth died, he'd been there. He knew what happened. The uncertainty would have driven him mad. They sat in silence for a while. Then James started talking. He told Nasha more about his life before the cabin, about growing up on a small farm in Missouri, about meeting Mary at a church social when he was 19, how she'd laughed at his terrible jokes and somehow agreed to marry him anyway. He described their journey west looking for a better life. The ranch where he'd worked, saving money to start his own place someday. The joy when Elizabeth was born, then the fever that swept through town, taking his whole world in the space of a week. I buried them on a Tuesday, James said, staring into the flames. Then I got on my horse and rode until I couldn't anymore. Ended up here. Built these walls around myself and swore I'd never let anyone in again. Nasha looked at him thoughtfully. But you let me in. Didn't have much choice. You collapsed on my porch. You have choice. You could close door. Let me die. James shifted uncomfortably. Couldn't do that? Why? It was a simple question, but James didn't have a simple answer. He'd asked himself the same thing 100 times over the past 2 weeks. Why had he helped her? Why had he taken such a huge risk? You reminded me of my daughter, he finally said. I know you're nothing alike. Elizabeth was just a baby, but lying there on my porch you looked so helpless. And I thought if Elizabeth had survived, if she'd grown up and somehow ended up wounded and alone at someone's door, I'd want them to help her. I'd want someone to show her kindness. Nasha nodded slowly. My father, he always say, we all connected. When you help stranger, you help family you not know yet. Smart man, your father. Yes, he very wise. Nasha's eyes got distant again. I miss him very much. I miss my mother, my brother, my people. Everything I know is gone or far away. James understood that feeling too. Being cut off from everything familiar, floating alone in the world. It was a special kind of loneliness. You're not alone anymore, he said. You're here now with me, for as long as you need. Nasha looked at him and something passed between them. An understanding. They were both damaged, both grieving, both trying to survive in a world that had taken everything from them. But maybe, just maybe, they could help each other heal. Over the next few weeks, the cabin began to feel different. It wasn't just a hermit's hiding place anymore. It was becoming a home. Nasha sang sometimes while she worked. Soft Apache songs that James didn't understand but found beautiful anyway. She laughed at his clumsy attempts to learn her language. She taught him how to weave grass into baskets, and he taught her how to play chess with an old set he'd forgotten he owned. The first time Nasha beat him at chess, James felt something he hadn't felt in 7 years. Pride. Not in himself, but in her. She was smart and quick, learning the game after only watching him set it up twice. On her 4th game, she managed to trap his king and her face broke into a huge grin. I win, she announced. You certainly did, James said, laughing. Actually laughing. When was the last time he'd laughed? Nasha's grin faded a bit. You not mad? Mad? Why would I be mad? Some men not like lose to girl. Well, I'm not some men. You won fair and square. You're good at this, the smile came back bigger than before. James realized how important this was to her. Being seen as capable, as smart, not just as a victim or a burden. As autumn approached and the air grew cooler, James noticed Nasha would sometimes stand at the window, looking out at the mountains. She'd get a faraway look in her eyes, and he knew she was thinking about her family, about the life she'd lost. He wanted to tell her it would be okay, but he wasn't sure it would be. The world was changing, and not for the better. Apache bands were being hunted down and forced onto reservations. Soldiers were everywhere, and they weren't gentle about it. Even here, in their isolated haven, they weren't truly safe. But for now, in these quiet moments by the fire, they had each other. 2 broken people who'd found unexpected companionship. James had stopped thinking of Nasha as an Apache girl who'd shown up on his porch. She was just Nasha. And somehow, without him quite noticing when it happened, she'd become important to him. The walls around his heart hadn't just developed cracks. They were crumbling, and the strange thing was James wasn't scared anymore. He was grateful. It was a Tuesday morning, about a month after Nasha had arrived, when James heard the horses. He was outside checking on Ash when the sound reached him. Multiple horses moving together in formation, soldiers. His blood went cold. He dropped the brush he'd been using and ran toward the cabin. "Nasha!" he called out as he burst through the door. "Soldiers coming. Get in the cellar, now." Nasha's face went white. She'd been kneading bread dough at the table, and flour covered her hands. For a moment she just stood there, frozen with fear. Then James's urgency broke through her panic. "Cellar," he repeated, pulling up the trapdoor in the floor near the fireplace. "Get down there and don't make a sound. No matter what you hear, stay silent." The root cellar was small and dark, just big enough for a person to crouch in. James used it to store potatoes and other vegetables through the winter. Now it would have to serve as a hiding place. Nasha climbed down quickly, her eyes wide with terror. "You'll be okay," James said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Just stay quiet." He dropped the trapdoor closed and quickly dragged the rug over it. Then he scattered some books and a pair of boots around to make the area look natural. Lived in. His heart was hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears. The sound of horses was louder now. James forced himself to take a breath and calm down. He needed to appear normal, annoyed at being disturbed but not nervous. Certainly not guilty. He grabbed his rifle and stepped out onto the porch, just as 6 soldiers rode into the clearing. They were led by a young officer with lieutenant's bars on his uniform. He had that fresh-faced Eastern look about him, like he'd never spent a hard day in his life before coming west. The kind of man who thought he knew everything and listened to nothing. "Morning," James called out, his voice flat and unfriendly. "You're on private property." The lieutenant held up a hand, signaling his men to stop. "Are you the owner of this property, sir?" "I am, and I don't recall inviting any visitors." "My name is Lieutenant Morrison. We're searching for an escaped Apache, a young female, approximately 15 years old. She escaped from a group being transported to the San Carlos reservation about a month ago." James kept his face completely neutral. "Haven't seen anyone. You're certain? She's wounded, possibly armed, and dangerous. She would need shelter and medical attention." "Like I said, haven't seen anyone. I live alone up here and I like it that way. If you gentlemen would kindly turn around and leave my property, I'd appreciate it." Morrison's eyes narrowed. He was suspicious, James could tell. The lieutenant dismounted and walked closer to the porch. His men followed suit, spreading out to surround the cabin. "You won't mind if we take a look around then?" "Actually, I do mind." "You got a warrant?" "We don't need a warrant to search for an escaped prisoner." "She's not a prisoner, she's a girl. And unless you've got legal paperwork, you're not searching my home." Morrison's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to people challenging his authority. But James stood his ground, rifle held casually but ready. He'd fought in the war back east, and he wasn't about to be intimidated by some young officer who probably got his commission through family connections. "Sir, I'm trying to be reasonable here," Morrison said. "This girl is dangerous. She's part of a band that killed 3 soldiers during the escape attempt." James raised an eyebrow. "That so? 3 trained soldiers killed by 1 wounded 15-year-old girl? Impressive. It wasn't just her. The whole group turned violent. Several escaped into the hills. We've caught most of them, but this girl is still out there somewhere. Well, she's not here. I live alone. Have for 7 years. Don't see many people, don't want to see many people. That's why I live all the way up here." Morrison glanced past James toward the cabin door. "You live alone, you say?" "That's right." "Then why are there 2 cups on your table?" James's stomach dropped, but he didn't let it show on his face. Through the open door, he could see what Morrison was looking at. 2 tin cups sat on the table along with 2 plates. One still had breadcrumbs on it from breakfast. "Think fast," he told himself. "I drink coffee in the morning, tea in the afternoon," James said without missing a beat. "Use different cups for different drinks. Wife used to insist on it, and I guess the habit stuck." It was a ridiculous explanation, but James delivered it with such matter-of-fact conviction that Morrison seemed to buy it. Or maybe he just couldn't think of a good argument against it. "Your wife lives here with you?" "My wife is dead. Has been for 7 years. But some habits die hard." Morrison studied James for a long moment. James met his gaze steadily, letting just enough annoyance and grief show through. The story was close enough to the truth that it came across as genuine. Finally, Morrison sighed. "All right. If you see anything suspicious, any sign of the girl, you need to report it immediately to the garrison in Copper Springs. She's considered armed and dangerous. If I see anyone out here, soldier or otherwise, I'll handle it myself. Don't need the Army's help." Morrison didn't like that answer, but there wasn't much he could do about it. He remounted his horse and gestured to his men. "Let's move out. We'll check the Miller place next." James stood on his porch, rifle still in hand, and watched them ride away. He didn't move until they were completely out of sight, disappearing over the ridge. Even then, he waited another 10 minutes, making sure they were really gone and not circling back. Finally, he went inside and pulled up the trap door. "They're gone," he called down softly. Nasha climbed out of the cellar, her face streaked with tears. She was shaking. Whether from fear or from being cramped in the small space, James couldn't tell. "Probably both. I'm sorry," she whispered. "I almost get you in trouble." "You didn't get me in anything. I chose to help you, remember? That's on me, not you. They looking for me?" "They not stop," James nodded grimly. She was right. The soldiers would keep searching. Eventually, someone might see smoke from his chimney and wonder why a hermit needed so much firewood. Or they might come back with a better excuse to search the cabin. "We'll figure it out," James said, though he had no idea how. "For now, you're safe." But even as he said it, James knew their time was running out. The soldiers might come back. Other Apache hunters or bounty seekers might come looking. The world was closing in on their little sanctuary, and sooner or later they'd have to face it. Nasha seemed to know it too. She looked around the cabin with sad eyes, like she was memorizing it. Like she knew this couldn't last forever. That night, neither of them could sleep. James sat in his chair, rifle across his lap, watching the windows. Every sound made him tense. Was that horses? Footsteps? Or just the wind? Nasha lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. James could tell she wasn't sleeping. Her breathing was too quick, too shallow. "Nasha," he said quietly into the darkness. "You okay?" There was a long pause. Then, "I should leave. Keep you safe." "No." "James, I said no." His voice was firm. "You're not healed enough to survive out there alone. And I'm not letting you go. Why you do this? Why you risk everything for me?" James was quiet for a moment. It was a fair question. Why was he risking his life, his freedom, his carefully constructed solitude for a girl he'd known for only a month? "Because," he finally said, "for 7 years I've been living, but I haven't been alive. I've been hiding from the world, hiding from feeling anything. Then you showed up and something in me woke up. You made me remember what it's like to care about someone, what it's like to have purpose beyond just surviving another day." He heard Nasha sniffle in the darkness. "I care about you too," she said softly. "You like father to me, better than father, because you choose to help me. You not have to, but you do anyway." James felt his throat tighten. He hadn't been called a father since Elizabeth died. He'd thought he'd never hear that word again, never feel that responsibility and love and fear that came with caring for a child. "Get some sleep," he said gruffly, trying to hide the emotion in his voice. "Tomorrow we'll start thinking about what comes next. But tonight you're safe, I promise." As the night wore on and the cabin slowly quieted, James made a decision. He'd protect Nasha no matter what it took. The soldiers could come back. The whole damn army could come. He wasn't going to let anyone take her. Not without a fight. He'd already lost one daughter. He wasn't about to lose another. The days following the soldiers' visit were tense. Every sound made them both jump. Every bird call could be a signal. Every shadow could be a threat. But as a week passed, then 2 with no return visit, they slowly began to relax. Nasha's shoulder was almost completely healed now. She could use her arm again, though it still ached when the weather changed. She'd thrown herself into helping around the property, as if working hard could somehow repay James for the risk he was taking. One morning, James found her trying to chop firewood. She was struggling with it, the axe too heavy and her injured shoulder too weak, but she kept trying. He watched her for a minute, admiring her determination, even as he worried she'd hurt herself. "Here," he said, taking the axe gently. "Let me show you a better technique. It's not about strength, it's about leverage." He demonstrated how to let the weight of the axe do most of the work, how to aim for the cracks in the wood, how to position your feet for balance. Nasha watched carefully, then tried again. This time the wood split cleanly. Her face lit up with pride. "I do it." "You sure did. You're a quick learner." They worked together that morning, James splitting the bigger logs while Nasha handled the smaller ones. It felt good to work side by side, to share the burden. James realized this was something he'd missed during his years alone. Not just the company, but the partnership, the feeling of being part of a team. As autumn deepened, the cabin began to change in small ways. Nasha had started gathering wildflowers and putting them in an old jar on the table. She'd organized the shelves, making everything neater and more accessible. She'd even started decorating, weaving dried grass into patterns and hanging them on the walls. One evening, James came back from checking his traps to find the cabin smelling amazing. Nasha had made a stew using rabbit, vegetables from the garden, and wild herbs she'd gathered. It was the best meal he'd had in years. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked, going back for a second bowl. "My mother teach me. She say good food make people happy. Happy people make good family." "Your mother was right. This is delicious." Nasha beamed at the compliment. Then her expression grew more serious. "James, I want to ask you something." "All right. The room. The one with door always closed. What is it?" James's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. He knew exactly what room she meant. "The nursery." He'd kept that door shut for 7 years, unable to bear looking at the empty cradle and the little clothes Mary had sewn. "That was going to be my daughter's room," he said quietly. "I can't go in there." Nasha nodded, understanding in her eyes. She didn't push, didn't ask more questions. But a few days later, James noticed the door to that room was open, just a crack. He stood in the hallway, his heart pounding, trying to decide what to do. Finally, he pushed the door open wider. Nasha was inside, cleaning. She'd opened the window to air out the room and was gently wiping dust from the cradle. When she saw him, she looked worried, like she'd overstepped. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I just think maybe this room should not be sad place anymore. Maybe it could be happy place again." James looked around the room he'd been avoiding for so long. It was just a room. 4 walls, a window, some furniture. The memories were painful, yes, but Nasha was right. Keeping it closed didn't honor Mary and Elizabeth's memory. It just kept the pain locked up where it couldn't heal. "It's okay," he said. "You can use this room if you want. Better than you sleeping on the floor by the fire." "Really?" Nasha's face brightened. "I can have own room." "It's yours." Over the next few days, Nasha moved into the room. She didn't change much, just added her few belongings and kept the window open to let in fresh air and sunlight. James would walk past and see her sitting on the small bed, braiding her hair or mending clothes, and it felt right somehow. The room had life in it again. They fell into a comfortable routine. James would wake before dawn and make coffee. Nasha would wake shortly after and start breakfast. They'd eat together, talking about the day's tasks. Then they'd split up the work, coming back together for the midday meal and again in the evening. James taught Nasha more English, and she taught him Apache. He learned to say thank you and good morning and be careful in her language. She learned to read from Mary's old books, stumbling over the words at first but improving quickly. One afternoon, James pulled out an old chess set from a trunk. It was dusty and some of the pieces were scratched, but it was complete. He'd loved chess once before grief had made everything seem pointless. "I teach you game," he said, setting up the board. Nasha watched as he explained the rules, how each piece moved. The goal of protecting your king while capturing your opponents. She picked it up surprisingly fast. By her 3rd game, she was giving James a real challenge. On her 4th game, she won. James stared at the board in disbelief, then started laughing. Actually laughing, deep belly laughs he hadn't experienced in years. "You beat me," he said, still laughing. "I win?" Nasha looked uncertain, like she wasn't sure if this was a good thing. "You definitely won. That was a smart move, trapping my king like that." Nasha's uncertainty melted into a huge grin. "I win. I beat James at chess." Her joy was infectious. James realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this happy. Not content, not just okay, but genuinely happy. It was a strange feeling after so many years of numbness. As winter approached, they prepared the cabin together. They gathered extra firewood, stacking it high against the outer wall. They preserved vegetables from the garden. They smoked meat from James's hunting trips. Nasha knew dozens of techniques for preserving food that James had never heard of, and she taught him all of them. One evening, as the first snow began to fall, they sat by the fire. Nasha was teaching James a traditional Apache song. He couldn't quite get the melody right and his pronunciation was terrible, but he tried. Nasha would correct him patiently. Then they'd both end up laughing at his mistakes. "You sound like dying elk," Nasha teased. "A dying elk? That's the best you can do?" "Maybe dying elk with cold." James threw a small pillow at her and she caught it, giggling. It struck him then how much she'd changed in the months since she'd arrived. She'd been so scared and serious at first, all that trauma and grief bottled up inside. Now she laughed easily. She teased him. She was acting like a normal teenager instead of someone carrying the weight of the world. Maybe he'd changed too. The angry, grief-stricken hermit who'd opened his door that evening was gone. In his place was someone who looked forward to each day, who enjoyed simple things like cooking together and playing chess and arguing about whether coffee or tea was better. "James," Nasha said, her voice turning serious. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. What happened when spring come? When soldiers come back? What we do?" It was the question James had been avoiding. Winter would protect them, making the cabin difficult to reach and giving them an excuse for why they needed so much firewood and food. But spring would come eventually. The snow would melt. The roads would clear, and the soldiers would have no reason not to search again. "I don't know," James admitted, "but we'll figure something out. Maybe we can get papers saying you're my ward or my adopted daughter. Maybe we can move somewhere the army isn't looking. I don't have all the answers, Nasha. But I promise you this, I'm not letting anyone take you. You're family now." Nasha's eyes filled with tears. "Family?" "Family," James confirmed. "You and me. We look out for each other. That's what family does." She moved across the room and hugged him. James tensed for just a moment, unused to physical affection after so long alone. Then he hugged her back. This girl who'd somehow broken through all his defenses and made him care again. "Thank you," Nasha whispered. "Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for giving me home. Thank you for giving me a reason to live again," James replied. They stayed like that for a moment, this unlikely family of two, while the snow fell softly outside and the fire crackled warmly inside. The cabin that had been a tomb for so long had transformed into a home. The man who'd closed his heart had opened it again, and the girl who'd lost everything had found a safe place to heal. Neither of them knew what the future would bring. The world outside was still dangerous. The soldiers were still searching. The reservation system was still destroying Apache families. But for now, in this moment, they had each other, and sometimes that was enough. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the mountains in white. Inside, two souls who'd been broken had found a way to help each other heal. It wasn't the family either of them had been born into, but it was the family they'd chosen, and that made it just as real. Winter came early that year, fierce and unforgiving. By mid-December, the snow was so deep that the cabin was completely cut off from the outside world. James and Nasha settled into a quiet rhythm, spending long evenings by the fire, playing chess and telling stories. Nasha's English was excellent now, and she could read almost as well as James. She'd gone through all three of Mary's books twice and was starting on them again. James had taught her basic arithmetic, and she'd taught him more Apache language and customs. They were good for each other, filling in the gaps in each other's knowledge and lives. One morning, James woke to an unusual sound. At first, he couldn't place it. Then he realized what it was, voices. Men's voices speaking Apache coming from outside the cabin. He jumped out of bed and grabbed his rifle. Nasha was already up, standing frozen at her bedroom window, her face pale. "Who is it?" James whispered. "I don't know. But they speaking my language." James moved to the window and carefully looked out. 3 Apache men stood in the clearing, their horses behind them. They looked exhausted, covered in snow, like they'd been traveling through the storm. One of them called out something in Apache. Nasha gasped. "Kuruk," she breathed. "That's my brother. My brother is alive." Before James could stop her, she ran to the door and yanked it open. The cold wind rushed in along with swirling snow. Nasha stood in the doorway, calling out to the men. One of them, the tallest, looked up. His face transformed with shock and joy. The man ran toward the cabin, and Nasha ran to meet him. They collided in the snow, hugging each other and talking rapidly in Apache. Both were crying. James watched from the doorway, his rifle still in hand, his heart heavy with an emotion he didn't want to name. After a few minutes, Nasha and her brother walked back to the cabin together. The other 2 men followed, leading the horses. Up close, James could see they were all young, probably in their early 20s. They looked at James with suspicion and wariness. "James," Nasha said, her face glowing with happiness despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "This is Kuruk, my brother." "Kuruk, this is James. He saved my life. He give me home." Kuruk studied James for a long moment. James met his gaze steadily. Finally, Kuruk spoke in halting English. You helped my sister? I did what anyone should have done. Not anyone do this. You risk much. Kuruk glanced at the other two men, then back at James. We come in? Very cold. James nodded and stepped aside. It went against all his instincts to invite strangers into his home, but these were Nasha's people. Her family. He couldn't turn them away, especially not in this weather. The three men came inside, bringing cold air and snow with them. James put more wood on the fire while Nasha fussed over her brother, checking him for injuries, asking a million questions in Apache. The other two men stood awkwardly near the door, clearly uncomfortable. James made coffee and everyone sat down. Through a mix of English and Apache with Nasha translating, the story came out. Kuruk and about a dozen others had escaped during the attack on the way to the reservation. They'd been hiding in the mountains ever since, moving camp frequently to avoid patrols. We hear about girl who escaped wounded, Kuruk said. I hope at you, Nasha. I look everywhere. Many moons. I think maybe you dead. Then we see smoke from this cabin and I think maybe she there. I almost was dead, Nasha said quietly. She told her brother about the shooting, about stumbling through the wilderness, about collapsing on James's porch, about how James had saved her life and taken her in. Even though it was dangerous, Kuruk listened to everything, his eyes moving between his sister and James. When she finished, he turned to James and did something unexpected. He stood and bowed his head slightly, a gesture of deep respect. You saved my sister's life, Kuruk said. My family owe you debt we can never repay. Thank you. James felt uncomfortable with the gratitude. I just did what was right. Many white men not do what is right. Many white men kill Apache girl and not think twice. You different. They talked for hours. Kuruk and his companions had been surviving in the mountains, hunting and gathering, staying ahead of army patrols. It was a hard life, but they refused to go to the reservation. They'd seen what happened to people there. The poor food, the sickness, the slow death of spirit and body. They'd rather die free in the mountains than waste away in a prison. As the afternoon wore on, James realized what was coming. Kuruk wanted Nasha to come with them. He could see it in the way the young man kept looking at his sister, in the way he talked about their group needing more people, especially people who knew the old ways. Finally, as evening approached, Kuruk said what James had been dreading. He spoke to Nasha in Apache for a long time. James couldn't understand most of it, but he understood enough. Come with us. Your people need you. You belong with your own kind. Nasha's face was torn. She looked at her brother, then at James, then back at her brother. She responded in Apache, her voice uncertain. They went back and forth, sometimes heated, sometimes gentle. What's he saying? James finally asked. Nasha turned to him, her eyes full of tears. He want me come with them. Live with our people in mountains. Stay free. And what do you want? I don't know. Her voice broke. I love my brother. I want be with my people. But She looked around the cabin at the home they'd built together. I love here too. I love you. You are family now, same as Kuruk. Kuruk said something sharp in Apache. Nasha snapped back at him. The two siblings argued, their voices rising. Finally, Nasha turned to James. Kuruk say I can't have both families. I must choose. Apache or white? Brother or you? He say I am Apache, I belong with Apache people. James felt like someone had punched him in the chest, but he knew Kuruk wasn't entirely wrong. Nasha did belong with her people. She had a brother who loved her, a culture and heritage that was being destroyed. Who was James to keep her from that? Your brother is right, James said quietly. You are Apache. That's part of who you are, and you shouldn't have to give that up. But you are part of who I am now, too. Nasha said, tears streaming down her face. These months with you, you teach me so much. You give me safe place to heal. You treat me like daughter. I can't just leave. James's throat was tight. He wanted to tell her to stay. He wanted to beg her not to go. She'd brought life back into his world, had given him purpose and joy he thought he'd never feel again. Losing her would be like losing Elizabeth all over again. But this wasn't about what he wanted. This was about what was best for Nasha. Listen to me, James said, taking her hands. You don't have to choose forever right now. But your brother is here. Your people need you, and winter won't last forever. When spring comes, the soldiers will be back. If they find you here, they'll take you to the reservation. At least with your brother, you'll be free. But what about you? You be alone again. I've been alone before. I'll manage. Nasha shook her head fiercely. No, that's not good enough. I not want you alone. I not want me without you. She spoke rapidly to her brother in Apache. Kuruk listened, his expression softening. He looked at James with new respect and said something back to Nasha. Her face lit up. Kuruk say, what if both? What if I go with them but I come visit you? Every season I come back to cabin. Stay with you for a little while, then go back to my people. That way I have both families. James blinked. He'd expected to lose her completely. The idea that she could split her time, maintain connections to both worlds hadn't occurred to him. Your brother would agree to that? Kuruk spoke directly to James in English. My sister very stubborn. Like our mother. I see she love you. You love her. I not take her from good father. She visit you, she visit us. She belong to two worlds now. Maybe that is good thing. Bridge between Apache and White. We need bridges. James felt tears in his own eyes now. You'd really come back? Every season, Nasha promised. Spring, summer, fall, winter. I always come back. You are my father now. Nothing changed that. James pulled her into a hug, not caring that Kuruk and the other men were watching. Okay, he said. Okay, you go with your brother. Learn your people's ways, stay free. But you come back to me, you hear? This will always be your home. Always, Nasha whispered. That night, they prepared for Nasha's departure. James packed her a bag with warm clothes, dried meat, and other supplies. Nasha moved through the cabin, touching things, memorizing every corner of the place that had become her sanctuary. In the morning, the snow had stopped. Kuruk said they needed to leave soon before the next storm hit. Nasha hugged James one last time. I come back in spring, she said. I promise, I'll be here, James replied. I'll always be here. He watched from the porch as Nasha rode away with her brother and the other men, heading up into the mountains. She turned back twice to wave, and each time James waved back. Then she disappeared into the trees, and James was alone again. But it felt different this time. Before he'd been alone because he was hiding from the world. Now he was alone because he'd let someone he loved fly free. And in the spring she'd come back. They'd have meals together, play chess, share stories. She'd tell him about life with her people. And he'd tell her about whatever adventures he'd had. Or maybe he'd have no adventures at all, and that would be fine too. James went back inside the cabin. It felt empty without Nasha's presence. But her things were still in her room. The winter after Nasha left was the longest of James's life. The cabin felt too quiet, too empty. But it was a different kind of emptiness than before. Before Nasha, the silence had been his shield, his protection from pain. Now the silence was just the space between visits, and he knew it wouldn't last forever. James kept himself busy. He repaired things around the cabin that he'd let slide for years. He built new shelves. He even started carving, something he hadn't done since he was a young man. His first project was a chess piece to replace one that had gone missing from the set. Then he carved a small owl, thinking of Nasha and what her name meant. As the snow began to melt and the first hints of spring appeared, James found himself watching the trail more often. Every day he'd step out onto the porch and look toward the mountains, wondering if today would be the day she returned. When she finally came, it was on a bright morning in early April. James was chopping wood when he heard a horse approaching. His hand went to his gun instinctively, then he saw her. Nasha, riding alone on a spotted pony, a huge smile on her face. James, she called out, waving. He dropped the axe and just stood there, grinning like a fool. She'd come back. She'd actually come back. Nasha dismounted and ran to him. They hugged, and James felt something inside him unclench. A fear he hadn't even admitted to himself. The fear that he'd never see her again finally let go. You came back, he said. I told you I would. Did you think I lie? No, I'm glad you're here. They went inside and Nasha told him everything. About life with Kuruk's band, living in hidden camps high in the mountains, about learning traditional skills from the elders, hunting techniques from the men, and medicine practices from the women. She'd grown in the months apart, James could see it. She carried herself with more confidence, more certainty about who she was, but she was also still his Nasha. She challenged him to a chess game immediately and beat him on the second try. She laughed at his terrible attempts to cook. She reorganized his shelves again because she said his system made no sense. She stayed for 3 weeks that spring. They fell back into their old routine easily, as if she'd never left. They worked together, cooked together, talked for hours by the fire. Nasha taught James more Apache words and told him stories about her people. James taught her more English words she didn't know and read to her from books. When it was time for her to leave again, it was easier. Not easy, but easier, because now James knew for certain that she'd return. "I come back in summer," Nasha promised. "Bring you fresh berries from the high country." "I'll be here," James said. "I'll always be here," and so it went. Nasha would visit each season, staying for a few weeks at a time. She'd tell James about her adventures with her brother's band, and James would tell her about what he'd been doing, which wasn't much, honestly, but that was okay. His life had gotten smaller in some ways, but richer in others. One day, about a year after Nasha had first left, James decided to ride into Copper Springs for supplies. He hadn't been to town in over a year, and he needed flour and coffee. As he rode down the main street, he could feel the stairs, the ghost of Silver Ridge coming down from his mountain. In the general store, the shopkeeper's wife couldn't contain her curiosity. "We heard you had a girl living with you," she said, not bothering to pretend she wasn't fishing for gossip. James met her gaze steadily. "That's right. My daughter. Your daughter? But I thought your daughter died years ago." "Mary and Elizabeth died, yes. But I have another daughter now." "Adopted her last year." The woman's eyes went wide. She clearly wanted to ask more questions, but something in James's expression warned her off. He paid for his supplies and left without another word. The truth was complicated. James had no legal papers saying Nasha was his daughter. She was Apache and he was white, and the world they lived in didn't make such arrangements easy. But in every way that mattered, she was his daughter and he was her father. They'd chosen each other. That was enough. Over time, other people began to learn about Nasha. James's nearest neighbors, the Miller family who lived about 10 miles away, met her one summer when she was visiting. They were surprised but kind, accepting James's simple explanation that she was his adopted daughter. The soldiers never came back. Either they'd given up searching for Nasha, or they'd assumed she'd died in the wilderness. James didn't care which. All that mattered was that she was safe. As the years passed, James noticed changes in both of them. Nasha was growing up, becoming a young woman. She was 17 now, then 18, then 19. She talked about young men in her brother's band, about learning to make traditional clothing, about teaching younger children the old stories. James was getting older too. His hair had more gray in it. His back ached more in the mornings. But he felt more alive than he had in decades. Nasha had given him purpose and joy. She'd opened his closed heart and let the light back in. One spring, Nasha brought Kuruk with her for a visit. The two men had developed a mutual respect over the years, though they'd only met a handful of times. Kuruk thanked James again for taking care of his sister. "You give her life twice," Kuruk said in his improving English. "Once when you heal her wounds. Second time when you give her home and family. We are brothers now, I think." James nodded, moved by the sentiment. Brothers, he agreed. The world was changing around them. The Apache wars were winding down. More and more bands were being forced onto reservations. Kuruk's group was one of the last holding out, and they all knew it couldn't last forever. But for now they were still free, still surviving in the mountains they'd always called home. One evening, as James and Nasha sat on the porch watching the sunset, she asked him a question that had clearly been on her mind. "James, are you happy?" "Really happy?" He thought about it for a moment. 7 years ago, he would have said happiness was impossible. He'd been convinced that his life was over, that nothing would ever matter again. But this girl, this wounded Apache teenager who'd collapsed on his porch, had changed everything. "Yes," he said simply. "I'm happy." "Are you?" "Very happy. I have 2 families now. My Apache family with Kuruk and my family here with you. Some people say I must choose one, but I say no. I choose both. I am Apache and I am your daughter." Both things true at same time, James smiled. She'd grown so much, this girl who'd been barely alive when she first arrived. She'd found a way to bridge 2 worlds that everyone said couldn't be bridged. She belonged to her people and their traditions, but she also belonged here in this cabin with him. "You know what your mother used to say?" James asked. "Mary, I mean. She used to say that family isn't just about blood. It's about who shows up, who stays, who chooses to love you even when it's hard." She sounded like a wise woman, she was. "I think she'd like you. And I think Elizabeth, if she'd lived, would have wanted a big sister just like you." Nasha leaned her head on James's shoulder. They sat like that as the sun sank below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Life settled into a rhythm that worked for both of them. Nasha would spend most of her time with Kuruk's band, learning the ways of her people, keeping those traditions alive. But every season, without fail, she'd come back to the cabin. She'd stay for a few weeks and they'd pick up right where they left off. James was no longer the hermit of Silver Ridge. Oh, people still called him that sometimes, but it didn't fit anymore. He'd help neighbors when they needed it, even made friends with the Miller family. He'd go into town more often, and while people still thought he was odd, they also respected him. He was the man who'd taken in an Apache girl and raised her as his own daughter at a time when most people wouldn't have given her a second glance. On Nasha's 20th birthday, James gave her something special. He'd been working on it for months, carving it carefully from a piece of oak. It was a small wooden box, decorated with carvings of owls and mountains and pine trees. Inside was a letter. Nasha opened the letter and read it slowly. Her English reading was excellent now. The letter explained that James had been to a lawyer in the territorial capital. He'd made a will, leaving everything he owned to Nasha. The cabin, the land, his savings, everything. It wasn't much, but it was his. "This is your home," the letter said. "No matter what happens to me, no matter where you are, you always have a place to come back to. You are my daughter in every way that counts, and this is your inheritance. Use it however you wish. Live here or sell it, or just know it's waiting for you. You gave me back my life when I thought I had nothing left to live for. This is the only way I know to say thank you." Nasha had tears streaming down her face by the time she finished reading. "James, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. Just promise me you'll keep coming back. Keep being who you are. That's all I want." She hugged him tight. "I promise, always." Years passed. James's hair went completely gray and he moved a bit slower than he used to. Nasha became a respected member of Kuruk's band, known for her knowledge of both Apache and white ways. She helped negotiate when conflicts arose, translating not just language but understanding between two very different cultures. Eventually, Kuruk's band did have to go to the reservation. It was that or be hunted down and killed. But by then things had changed slightly.